There's a specific point in a difficult conversation, the kind that hasn't ended cleanly, the kind that leaves something unresolved hanging in the room, where the keys come off the hook before they've consciously decided to ride. They check the weather without knowing why. They're already in the garage, helmet in hand, before any clear thought has formed about a destination. The destination doesn't matter. The direction barely matters. What matters is that something in the brain has identified a state of overload, too many open loops, too much unprocessed input, and is reaching for a known mechanism of relief. This is not impulsivity. This is a learned, embodied response to a particular kind of cognitive saturation. And to understand it, we have to set aside the most common explanation people reach for, that the writer is escaping, because that word, while popular, gets the psychology almost entirely wrong. The word escape implies movement away from something, avoidance, a refusal to deal. And while it's an easy story to tell from outside, it doesn't describe what's actually happening cognitively. When someone reaches for the bike at exactly the moment their life is most demanding, what's happening is closer to what environmental psychologist Stephen Kaplan called restoration. Kaplan's attention restoration theory proposes that the kind of attention we use for work, decisions, conflicts, and problem solving, what he called directed attention, has a limited capacity. It fatigues, and once fatigued, it can't be willed back into function by trying harder. It needs specific conditions to recover. Not sleep, exactly. Not distraction. A particular kind of environment that engages the mind without taxing it. What Kaplan called involuntary attention. Soft fascination. The mind held lightly by something that doesn't demand effort. Natural environments do this. Walking through a forest does this. And for a particular kind of person, riding a motorcycle does this. Not despite its demands, but because of the very specific way those demands occupy the mind. So the central reframe is this. The writer is not moving away from the problem. They are moving toward the only state in which their brain can actually metabolize it. This isn't running from the problem. This is creating the conditions the brain needs to actually do something with it. There are three distinct psychological mechanisms at work when someone rides through difficulty. They overlap, but they're worth separating. The first is sensory absorption. Riding a motorcycle requires a continuous, low-grade allocation of attention to the physical world. Lean angle, road surface, throttle position, peripheral movement, the mirror, the merge. None of it overwhelming, but none of it ignorable. This sustained sensory and motor demand has a specific neurological consequence. It suppresses what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the network most active when the mind is unoccupied, and the network most responsible for rumination. Rumination is the loop where the same unresolved thought cycles back through the mind without progressing. It feels like thinking, but it isn't generative. Writing interrupts that loop, not by silencing the mind, but by giving it a different job to do underneath. This is why writers typically come back from a long ride, with clarity rather than with answers. Clarity is not the same as resolution. Clarity is the absence of static. The sense that whatever the situation is, it has stopped distorting itself. The problem may still be there, but it's no longer hidden behind its own noise. The second mechanism is the physical-emotional processing link. There is a substantial body of research suggesting that physical movement accelerates the processing of emotional material in ways that stillness does not. Therapeutic modalities like EMDR, somatic experiencing, and even simple bilateral walking all rest on a version of this principle. The body moving through space is not separate from the mind working through something. In many ways, it is the mind working through something. When we sit still with a difficult emotion, the brain often gets stuck. Looping the same fragment, the same image, the same line from the conversation. When the body begins moving through varied space, sensory input refreshes continuously. The nervous system shifts out of fixed arousal, and the emotional material which had been frozen in place begins to move with the body. This is why writers often notice that something which felt entirely unresolvable before a long ride feels different, not necessarily resolved, but no longer locked. Sometimes a decision has quietly made itself. Sometimes a feeling has changed shape. Sometimes nothing visible has happened, but the weight has redistributed. The grief has not gone anywhere. It simply isn't sitting in the same place anymore. The third mechanism is the temporal structure of the ride itself. A ride has an architecture. It has a beginning. It has momentum. It has turns that have to be taken in sequence. It has a horizon and, eventually, a return. For someone in the middle of a situation that feels formless, a grief without a timeline, a decision that refuses to crystallize, a conflict with no clear shape, this imposed structure has a measurable psychological effect. Human brains organize experience temporally. When the events of life lose their sense of sequence, when everything is happening at once or nothing is moving at all, the mind reaches for any structure that can restore the sense of one thing, then another. Movement through space is one of the most ancient and reliable sources of that structure. Walking does it, driving does it, riding does it more vividly because the rider is more bodily implicated in the unfolding of the trip. The ride becomes a kind of temporary scaffolding. While the larger situation remains shapeless, this smaller thing, this hour, this route, this sequence of curves has form. And in that small zone of form, the brain finds enough orientation to begin reorganizing the larger one. For someone who doesn't ride, this can be hard to read accurately. What they see is someone walking out the door at a moment when staying would have been easier. And the most natural interpretation, especially in the middle of conflict, is abandonment, withdrawal, a refusal to engage. But here's a more accurate description of what's happening. They see someone leaving. What's actually happening is someone creating the conditions to come back more capable than they left. It only looks like abandonment if you don't understand what the brain is doing during that time. For partners and family members, the experience can still be genuinely painful. The timing often feels wrong. The conversation hadn't ended. The decision hadn't been made. And then, instead of pushing through, the rider goes quiet, gathers their gear, and disappears for 2 hours or 4 or sometimes longer. It can feel like being left mid-sentence by someone who has chosen something else over you. What can change that experience is understanding what the ride is for. It isn't a refusal to engage with you. It's a refusal to engage badly. To stay in a state of cognitive saturation where nothing they say will be useful, where they're only capable of looping rather than thinking. The ride is, in a sense, an act of preparation for the conversation, even if it doesn't look that way. The rider who comes home after a long ride is rarely the same person who left. They're usually quieter, slower, more able to listen. The version of them you needed to talk to was, in many cases, only available on the other side of that ride. This doesn't make it easy. It doesn't dissolve the loneliness of being the one left behind for a few hours. But it changes what's being witnessed. It isn't someone running from you. It's someone doing the only thing they know how to do to come back to you intact. None of this is unique to motorcycles. Every person has some version of this, some environment or activity that creates conditions for the brain to do work it can't do in normal life. For some people, that's running, or fishing, or driving alone at night, or long walks in the woods, or swimming laps until the body becomes the thinking. For some people, it's the motorcycle. The vehicle changes. The psychology is the same. What all of these share is a particular combination. Enough sensory engagement to quiet rumination, enough physical movement to metabolize what's stuck, and enough imposed structure to give shapeless feelings something to lean against. If you're a rider, what's worth knowing is that this isn't a flaw in how you cope. It's a real mechanism with a real name, and it's working on you in real ways. Honor it, but also recognize what it isn't. It isn't a substitute for the conversations you eventually have to come home and have. It's the preparation for them. And if you love someone who rides, who disappears into a helmet and a horizon at the moments you most want them present, what's worth knowing is that the disappearance isn't what it looks like. They aren't choosing the bike over you. They're going to get the version of themselves you need them to be. The road isn't the answer. The ride isn't the answer. But the conditions a ride creates, those conditions are sometimes where the answer can finally arrive.